falling in Plainfield, and the darkness seemed to cling to the town like a suffocating veil. The wind sliced through the empty field, carrying whispers of a past that had never been buried. Michael Collins didn't believe in ghosts, but as he gazed at the ruins of Ed Gein's farmhouse, he felt a different kind of chill. Not the cold of the breeze, but the kind that seeps into your bones when the truth, far worse than any legend, lurks nearby. He was here to seek answers. What he didn't know was that the answers were waiting for him. Michael Collins was used to stories of violence and madness. As an investigative journalist, he had seen it all. Or so he thought. His current assignment, a retrospective on Ed Gein, the infamous Plainfield killer, seemed like more of the same. A deranged maniac with mental issues who shocked the nation. Initially, the case didn't interest him. Gein was already dead. Plainfield had long been drained of any novelty. And Mike had little patience for revisiting the past. But something nagged at him. Something didn't quite fit. As he combed through old newspaper archives and police reports, he came across a brief and almost dismissible mention. A series of disappearances that occurred around the same time as Gein's crimes, but were never officially linked to the killer. Most of these people were never found. There were no bodies, and the files were vague, as if someone had preferred to keep those stories buried. Something about this discovery sparked Mike's curiosity. He spent nights poring over digital archives trying to find a pattern, a connection. The more he dug, the clearer it became that these disappearances had been swept under the rug like a forgotten part of the narrative. It was enough to justify a trip to Plainfield. Sitting in his office in Milwaukee, he stared at the scribbled notes and old headlines scattered across his desk. It was a long shot, and he knew it. His editor expected a standard piece on the butcher of Plainfield. But something in those files, the way the police seemed to have let the investigation slide, made him suspicious. There was more to this story. He could feel it. The next morning he drove toward Plainfield, a town that seemed frozen in time. As soon as he crossed the city's limits, a growing unease settled over him. The vast fields and scattered houses gave off a sense of isolation. It was as if the place had never fully recovered from the shock of Gein's crimes. The few locals he saw looked wary, as if still burdened by the weight of the past. He parked his car outside a small local bar, a place that appeared to be the town's social hub. As he entered, Mike was met with quick glances and uncomfortable silences. The name Ed Gein still provoked reactions among these people, and he knew that extracting any information would be a challenge. He ordered a beer and sat at the bar, waiting for the right moment to start a conversation. After a few minutes of casual talk with the bartender, Mike began asking questions. He mentioned Ed Gein, and the atmosphere in the bar shifted immediately. People stopped talking, their eyes now focused on him, as if he had said something forbidden. The bartender, a middle-aged man with a tired face, averted his eyes and pretended not to have heard. "What else can you tell me about the disappearances from back then?" Mike pressed as a few patrons murmured something unintelligible and nervously returned to their conversations. A low, raspy voice came from the corner of the bar. "You think you know everything, don't you? Ed Gein, he was just a part of it. People don't want to remember because they know he wasn't alone." Mike turned to face the man who had spoken, an old man with scraggly white hair and vacant eyes. He had the expression of someone who knew more than he should. "Who are you?" Mike asked, trying not to show the sudden chill creeping up his spine. "Earl Parsons," the old man replied, his eyes briefly shining before he returned his gaze to his whiskey glass. "If you want the truth, you're not gonna like what you find." Before Mike could ask more, two men approached Earl, grabbing him by the arm and muttering something Mike couldn't hear. They led him out of the bar, leaving behind an oppressive sense that the old man had much more to say. Mike was left alone, his heart pounding. Something was very wrong in this town. Mike left the bar with a heavy feeling in his chest, as if something invisible was squeezing his lungs. He knew Earl Parsons was the key to understanding what was going on, but what he had said left Mike disoriented. Ed Gein wasn't alone. Who were these others? He would need to get closer, dig deeper. Plainfield, however, was not welcoming to outsiders, especially those who poked around in its dark past. As Mike walked the nearly deserted streets, he noticed how the few people who passed him watched him with suspicion. It was as if they knew he was there for more than just casual curiosity. The oppressive atmosphere in the town was undeniable. Walking through the streets, Mike realized how much Plainfield seemed like a place forgotten, as if time had stopped right after Gein's arrest. The only difference was the presence of a few newer shops and buildings, which somehow felt out of place, like patches covering cracks in a broken vase. He arrived at the hotel where he would be staying, a modest old establishment with a neon sign flickering vacancy. The receptionist, a man with a blank expression, barely glanced up from his newspaper as Mike walked in. "You're the journalist, right?" The man didn't wait for a response. "Room 12. Stairs to the right." Without another word, Mike climbed the creaking steps, feeling that something was wrong but unable to pinpoint exactly what. His room was simple, with a small bed, a worn wooden desk, and a window that looked out onto the main street. As soon as he entered, the sensation of being watched returned. He yanked the curtain shut and tried to push away the growing paranoia. Even so, he knew something was off, something that made people uneasy. The town's very silence seemed to hold whispered secrets, as if the streets themselves harbored unspeakable memories. He needed more answers, and he knew Earl Parsons would be the starting point. The next day, Mike decided to try a new approach. He visited the small town records office, hoping to find something that would take him beyond the known stories. The woman behind the counter, pale-faced and expressionless, eyed him suspiciously as he asked questions about the disappearances. "Those records, they were lost in the town hall fire back in the 60s, she said, her voice as sharp as glass. "Lost?" Mike raised an eyebrow. "Nothing was recovered?" "No," she answered flatly, as if she didn't want to discuss the matter further. Mike left the office feeling blocked at every turn. No one wanted to talk, and now it seemed that the records had conveniently been destroyed. But he wouldn't give up so easily. He knew there was more to this town than a fire and forced silence. Later, back at the bar, Mike spotted Earl again. This time, he was alone. Mike approached and carefully sat beside him. The old man looked tired, as if burdened by decades of secrets. "You said Gein wasn't alone," Mike began, lowering his voice. "Who were the others?" Earl looked at him, and for a moment Mike saw a flash of genuine fear in the old man's eyes. "You shouldn't be messing with this, son," Earl whispered. "They're still out there." Earl's answer echoed in Mike's mind like muffled thunder. "They're still out there." That was enough to keep him awake, his head swirling with unanswered questions. Who were they? What did Earl know, and more importantly, why wasn't anyone else in town talking about it? Mike knew he had to investigate on his own. But by now, Plainfield felt like a minefield of buried secrets. The next morning, he got in his car and drove to the ruins of Ed Gein's old farmhouse. The remnants of a grotesque and disturbed life lay there, covered in dust and ravaged by time. The few walls still standing leaned precariously, as if ready to collapse at any moment. The air around the property was strange, heavy, as if the entire place was trapped in a bubble of lingering darkness. Mike parked and stepped out of the car, carefully making his way toward the house, avoiding the overgrown weeds that had taken over the land. The place had a presence. Every step he took on the ground seemed to echo something deeply buried beneath it. As he passed through the doorless entrance, he found himself surrounded by the debris of the past. An old table was overturned on the floor, with rusty cutlery scattered around. Fragments of furniture and other personal items lay buried in dust and neglect, giving the impression that time had stopped the exact moment Ed Gein was arrested. Mike searched the place for hours. There were legends about Gein hiding things in the house, but most curiosity hunters had already taken anything of value. Yet something inside him urged him to keep looking. It was then, by accident, when he stepped on a loose floorboard, that he heard a deep echo, a hollow sound. He knelt down and cleared the debris with his hands, revealing a worn wooden door, hidden beneath a thick layer of dust and rubble. The door led to a basement, one that had not been mentioned in the old police reports. Mike wasn't sure what he would find, but by now he was in too deep to turn back. With effort, he pulled the heavy door open, which creaked loudly, exposing a stone staircase that descended into total darkness. The air was dense and cold, like that of a cave. Mike turned on his flashlight and began to descend, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. What he found in the basement made his stomach turn. The room was small, with walls covered in esoteric symbols that Mike had never seen before. They appeared to be hand-carved with disturbing precision. In the center of the room stood a makeshift altar, covered in melted candles and bones. Nearby, a dusty but intact journal rested atop a pile of ancient, decaying books. The cover was worn, but the pages inside were in good condition. Mike flipped through the first few pages and quickly realized that the text was coded, with scrambled symbols and letters. He held in his hands something far greater than a personal relic. This journal wasn't Gein's but belonged to someone deeply involved with what appeared to be a secret society. A cult, perhaps. The tension in his chest increased as he turned more pages. Descriptions of strange rituals, sacrifices. There were mentions of something called the Entity, a presence that the cult worshipped and to which they offered lives. Gein had been merely a tool, someone easily manipulated to carry out the group's darkest desires. Suddenly, the cold in the basement became more oppressive, as if the air was being drained. Mike looked around, feeling a sudden paranoia creep down his spine. He needed to get out of there, and fast. With the journal in hand, he rushed up the stairs, almost tripping in his haste. When he reached the surface, panting, Mike took one last look at the farmhouse before sprinting to his car. As he started the engine, he had the distinct impression that he was not alone. A shadow moved quickly in his rearview mirror, but when he turned around, there was nothing. The journal was now with him, and he knew, with a growing sense of unease, that this was only the beginning. That night, Mike's sleep was more turbulent than ever. He had the constant feeling of being watched, as if something invisible lurked in the shadows of the hotel room, waiting for him to close his eyes. When he finally drifted off to sleep, he was immediately pulled into a nightmare. He found himself back in Ed Gein's basement, but this time the darkness around him was alive, pulsing. The candles lit around the altar cast distorted shadows on the walls, which moved as if they had a will of their own. In the center of the altar, a hooded figure whispered unintelligible words, the sounds echoing directly into Mike's mind, like a serpent slithering through his brain. Mike tried to scream, but no sound came from his mouth. His legs felt heavy as if they were chained to the floor by invisible shackles. The figure on the altar turned toward him, revealing a face that was not human. It was distorted, almost formless, as if made of flesh and shadows. The creature's hollow black eyes fixed on him, and then everything went dark. He awoke abruptly, his heart pounding in his chest, drenched in cold sweat. Glancing at the clock, he realized that only 2 hours had passed since he had fallen asleep. The darkness in the room felt thicker, and the silence was deafening. For the first time in his career as a journalist, Mike felt genuine fear. A fear that wasn't rational, but primal, instinctual. The next morning, he decided to return to the journal. He needed to decode what was inside. He went down to the small hotel cafe, and with bitter coffee in hand, began analyzing the coded pages. He used his phone to look up possible meanings of the symbols and references. The details described in the passages he managed to understand were disturbing. Blood rituals, human sacrifices, the invocation of a dark entity worshipped by generations in the town of Plainfield. The notes detailed macabre ceremonies that took place deep in the forest on the darkest nights, when the moon was hidden. Animal sacrifices had become insufficient for the cult. They needed more. They needed human flesh, and Ed Gein, mentally unstable and easily manipulated, was the perfect vessel to channel these energies and carry out the most grotesque acts. As the hours passed, Mike's mind filled with images he wished he could erase. The graphic descriptions of the rituals were so vivid that he began to wonder if he had witnessed something like this before. As if his mind was slowly being invaded by these memories, he started having flashes of visions, images of mutilated bodies, blood dripping from altars, and the voices, those same whispering voices from his nightmare, now seemed ever present in his head. As the days passed, Mike's behavior began to change. He no longer trusted his own senses. Every sound he heard seemed louder. Every shadow he saw in his peripheral vision seemed to move imperceptibly. On several occasions, he swore he saw someone following him, but when he turned, there was no one there. The isolation of Plainfield, which had once seemed like a mere characteristic of a small town, was now suffocating. He was completely alone, with no one to share his discoveries with. The feeling of being watched intensified day by day. His phone, which had once served as a lifeline to the outside world, now felt like a trap. Anonymous calls began coming in, always in the middle of the night. The voice on the other end said nothing. It only breathed slow and heavy, as if something was lurking. One afternoon, he decided to confront Earl again. He needed more answers before he completely lost his mind. When he arrived at the bar, however, Earl was nowhere to be found. The bartender, who had previously ignored him, now looked at him with a darker expression. "Earl's gone," he said without looking up from the glass he was cleaning. "Some people can't handle the past and end up leaving." "Where did he go?" Mike pressed, his voice tense, but the bartender only shrugged as if the answer didn't matter. Mike left the bar with his stomach churning, feeling more alone in his search than ever. He returned to the hotel, and as he passed through the door of his room, he felt something that made him stop. A sensation that the air around him had changed. It was subtle but undeniable, as if he was no longer alone in that room. Night fell quickly, and as the shadows stretched across the walls, Mike began to wonder, what was really happening in Plainfield? What had he unleashed by meddling with that journal? When he turned off the lights to try to sleep, the shadows seemed to move again, but this time he didn't have the courage to check. Mike barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt a presence in the room, something he couldn't see, but that was there, watching. By this point, he no longer knew if what he was feeling was real or a product of his exhausted mind. The journal, the voices, the shadows, everything seemed to be pulling him into an abyss he couldn't escape. The next morning, he decided to return to the town center to talk to the few locals who hadn't yet dismissed him with uncomfortable silences. He was obsessed. There was something bigger behind Ed Gein's crimes, something that Plainfield was hiding with all its might, and the sudden disappearance of Earl Parsons made him even more alert. Mike spent the day walking through the town, noticing details he had previously overlooked. Small symbols carved into stones and gates, discreetly placed on the facades of old houses, began to catch his attention. They were similar to the ones he had found in Gein's farmhouse basement. With this new awareness, he noticed how the town was filled with signs of something ancient and dark. His investigation led him to the local library, an old stuffy building where the librarian, a taciturn elderly woman, looked at him with a warning expression, as if she knew exactly what he was looking for. She handed him a box of old records and disappeared among the shelves. In the hours that followed, Mike read about Plainfield's old history, forgotten documents that no one seemed to have consulted in decades, a series of mysterious disappearances dated back long before Ed Gein. These disappearances were always treated as isolated cases or attributed to accidents, but the pattern was unmistakable. People disappeared every few years, and the investigations never went anywhere. And most disturbing, the rituals described in the journal he had found seemed to align perfectly with these cycles. There were also veiled mentions of a secret society, formed by Plainfield's founding families, who had made a pact with an entity long before the town's official founding. This cult's purpose was to ensure prosperity and protection in exchange for sacrifices, and what had begun as smaller rituals had grown more and more grotesque over the generations. The connection between Ed Gein and this cult became increasingly clear. He had been more than just a lone killer. He was the instrument of something much larger, a pawn used to carry out the most horrendous rituals. But Gein, mentally unstable, had lost control, accidentally exposing the cult's horror. Now, however, the cult remained, and the rituals had never ceased. The shock of these discoveries weighed on Mike. The cult, under the guise of local families, was still active, hiding in plain sight, disguising its acts as local tradition. The disappearances, the rituals, everything continued, and the people of Plainfield lived in a state of denial, or worse, complicity. The entire town was involved one way or another. That same afternoon, as Mike returned to town, something caught his attention. A simple poster taped to a shop window, Harvest Festival. All welcome. He had seen mentions of this event in his readings about the town, described as an annual celebration, a community event that involved nearly all the residents. But now, after his discoveries about the cult, he viewed the festival with different eyes. The festival, scheduled for the weekend, coincided with one of the dates mentioned in the journal for one of the major sacrifice rituals. What had once seemed like an innocent local celebration now took on a much darker meaning. Mike knew that if he wanted to expose the truth, he would need to attend this event. The day of the festival arrived far too quickly. The town was busier than usual, with food stalls, traditional music, and lively conversations filling the central square. To any outsider looking in, Plainfield seemed like a peaceful town, proud of its traditions. But Mike felt the weight of what was about to happen. He knew the real event would take place far from curious eyes, somewhere isolated just as described in the journal. Late in the afternoon, as the shadows began to lengthen, he followed a small group of locals who discreetly slipped away from the main square and walked toward the forest surrounding the town. Mike kept his distance, but trailed them through the trees, making sure he wasn't noticed. The group consisted of about a dozen people, all dressed plainly, but carrying with them an aura of dark purpose. The walk through the forest seemed endless. The trees closed in around them, muffling the sounds of the distant town. The only noise was the rustling of leaves beneath their feet and the occasional whisper of the wind, which seemed to speak to him, as if the forest itself was aware of what was about to happen. Finally, they reached a clearing. In the center stood a crude altar made of stone, very similar to what Mike had seen in the journal's descriptions and later in Gein's basement. Candles were lit around it, casting a pale, flickering light in the growing darkness. The townspeople formed a circle around the altar, and soon, a deathly silence fell over the place. Mike, hidden among the trees, watched with his heart pounding in his chest. Everything felt surreal. He was about to witness what he knew was a real sacrifice ritual, something he had only thought existed in the pages of the horror books he investigated. And then, the ceremony began. A hooded figure emerged from the group, carrying what appeared to be a small, bound, trembling lamb. The animal was placed on the altar, and the figure murmured words in a language Mike couldn't understand, but which echoed in his mind like a deep reverberation. The air around him seemed to grow denser, heavier. Even from a distance he could feel the presence of something that didn't belong in this world. But the animal sacrifice was only the beginning. Mike knew from the journal that this was a prelude to something far more terrifying. That's when he saw the true horror. A second hooded figure brought a person, a young local, to the altar. The young man was gagged, his eyes wide with fear, struggling futilely to free himself. Mike's heart raced. He was witnessing the human sacrifice the journal had mentioned. The blade gleamed in the candlelight as it was raised, and Mike felt an instinctive urge to run, to do something to stop it, but he was paralyzed. He knew that any wrong move would cost him his own life. The knife came down. The young man's muffled scream was short, and the blood began to drip slowly onto the stones of the altar. The voices of the cult members grew louder, their chants more intense, as if something was being awakened there, something they had worshipped for centuries. The atmosphere around Mike changed. The air became thick, suffocating, and he felt a presence approaching. The same presence that had haunted him in his dreams and the shadows of his room. The feeling of being watched returned, but this time he knew exactly what was looking at him. The entity the cult was invoking. And at that moment, in the midst of the macabre ritual, Mike made the fatal mistake. A branch snapped beneath his feet. Every face turned toward him. The snap of the branch echoed like a gunshot in the clearing. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. Every eye, empty and human, turned toward Mike's direction. He froze, fear coursing through his veins like poison. The hooded figures exchanged glances and without a word began to move slowly toward him. Mike felt the urge to run, but his feet seemed rooted to the ground. The clearing, the blood-soaked altar, the chants now drumming in his head, echoing endlessly, drove him to the brink of madness. He took a step back, stumbling, trying to catch his breath, but it was useless. Before he could escape, two hooded figures grabbed him by the arms, dragging him toward the center of the clearing. His protest echoed through the forest, but no one in town would hear. They were far too absorbed in the Harvest Festival celebrations, completely oblivious to the horror unfolding in the woods. Mike was dragged to the altar where the blade still gleamed in the candlelight, stained with the blood of the previous sacrifice. He struggled, trying to free himself, but the cult members held him with brutal strength, as if every movement only encouraged them more. Panic choked him. It was real. He was next. The human sacrifice the entity craved. The same fate that had sealed the lives of so many others who had disappeared over the years. You thought you could escape. One of the hooded figures' voices was familiar, and when the man lowered his hood, Mike recognized the bartender from the hotel. His face was calm, as if the act he was about to commit was as ordinary as serving a drink. Mike tried to speak, but his voice failed him. All he managed was a hoarse whisper. "Why?" The bartender tilted his head, his eyes cold, devoid of any emotion. "There have always been sacrifices. There always will be. We feed the entity and it protects us. Gein, everyone is part of this. He shrugged as if Mike's fate had been sealed long ago. You should have stayed out of it. Without further ceremony, Mike was thrown onto the altar. He could feel the cold of the blood-stained stones against his skin, the metallic smell of the previous sacrifice still hanging in the air. The knife was raised again, the ghostly gleam of the moon reflecting off its surface. The chants around him grew louder, more frantic. Mike knew it was the end, but deep down something inside him shattered, an absolute despair that consumed him. He tried to scream, but the voice was stuck in his throat. There was no escape, no salvation. When the knife came down, he felt no pain, only a complete and silent darkness embraced him. The next morning, the town of Plainfield awoke in silence as if nothing had happened. The harvest festival was over, and the celebrations continued. Mike Collins became just another disappearance among many. His absence never explained, his body never found. The cult returned to its routine. The entity was satisfied for now. The town remained safe and life would go on as always, but the shadows in the forest continued to watch, waiting for the next sacrifice. And so the cycle of blood and sacrifice continued without end.